Good morning or even good afternoon, everyone. This is the first of a series of webinars which are going to be running on Scope 3, building a greenhouse gas. I will wait about another 30 seconds for everyone else to join, and then we're going to start on the webinar. Okay, hello everyone. So welcome. This is the first of 3 webinars that we're going to be running looking at greenhouse gas emissions, and in particular it's looking at Scope 3. So that's the activities that takes place outside of the normal operational controls for an organisation. And we're going to be looking at a bit more detail some research work which IWFM, the Sustainability SIG, is involved in. So if I introduce the 3 speakers. So myself, my name is Sunil Shah. I'm the Managing Director of Cloud Advisory. And we've got 2 speakers, Augustine, who is from Optima Gruppo, and Lewis from Bouygues Energies and Services. The areas that we're going to be covering today is an overview of the SFMI Scope 3 research, which IWFM are involved in, and then to go through in more depth around how the greenhouse gas data has been captured and how it's been used, and some lessons learned from 2 organisations who've got a huge amount of knowledge through both Augustine and Lewis, and then some time at the end for some Q&A. So if you've got any questions, please do put them into the Q&A function as well, please. Okay, so I'll just run through at the beginning some background in terms of why this research came about and some of the areas that we're looking at developing as part of that. So before I get into that, just a quick overview in terms of who the SFMI is. So the Sustainable FM Index, we started off 10 years ago, and it's around looking at driving ESG leadership within the FM industry. So the roles that we have as part of that is looking not only around current performance and providing a forward roadmap, but it's also providing some of the skills and forward direction, as well as some of the technical underpinning as well around that. So a lot of what we're trying to do is to upskill, but also it's about looking at the successes from the sector as well. So greenhouse gas emissions from the FM sector has become a huge topic. Lots of organisations talking about it, lots of organisations asking their supply chain to start to communicate. And so looking at it from a very simplistic basis, we have 3 scopes: Scope 1, Scope 2 and Scope 3. For organisations, there's a lot of reporting around Scope 1 and 2, which is typically the areas which you have more control of: your gas, your electricity, your fleet vehicles, which you have ownership of, would come within that. But for most organisations, the Scope 3, which is the supply chain and it's the other activities that takes place, is a huge part of what the emissions for an organisation. Typically for FM, it's around 72% of emissions that comes within this area. And so overall, having an understanding of what these emissions are is critical to be able to understand what we can do to move towards net zero. And that's not only from an organisational perspective in in-house operations, but it's also looking at some of the outsourced activities, so the FM provision of services and how the supply chain can also support organisations being able to get there. And so a large part of this is starting to look at what is the role of FM and what kind of emissions are being generated as a result of that. So ultimately, buildings are used for bringing people together. That's their purpose. And so as part of that, it isn't just about the materials and the energy that's consumed within it, but it's also all of the other parts that help to bring people together within the building. So that includes the catering activities, it includes some of the reception services, some of the security activities, the provision of the people and the equipment that allows for all of that to happen, the food that takes place, the grounds management activities as well. So all of that forms part of the FM role, but currently isn't included when we start talking about whole life carbon buildings. So what we're starting to look at is how do we ensure that when we do look at the whole impact that a building has, it does include the FM services as part of that. And so that's where this research project came into being. So it's very much about how do we start to look at what this holistic view of running a building is, and the FM operations happen year in, year out throughout the entire life of the building. So whilst they may be small on a year-by-year basis, once we start adding that up to 30 years to 50 years to 60 years for the life of the building, it can end up becoming quite a significant impact upon the whole part of the building. The other parts of that is then what do we start to do with that data and information? So once we understand the data, that's the starting point, but what we want to move into is the ability of being able to have consistency in the way that we measure the data and that we report it, but then for that data to start to be used across the built environment so that we can include it within contracts, we can start to look towards that net zero built environment. So the research itself is a 4-stage program. Both Optima and Bouygues are involved in phase 2 of the work, where we're starting to look at developing and stress testing the guidance documents that we have. So we already have a standard which exists and provides the FM sector with a consistent approach to measuring greenhouse gas emissions, the scope 3 emissions. And then we're moving into a stage 4 later on this year, where we'll start to look at between 150 and 200 contracts that we can apply the methodology through to validate that data, and that provides us with emissions factors, which we can then start to use. And ultimately, this will become adopted then by the UN and by other various bodies to become the globally recognised decarbonisation pathway for the FM industry. And the organisations that are involved, I've mentioned Optima and Bouygues already involved in that, but we also have BAM and Skanska involved, and then it's also supported by 3 professional institutes, IEMA, RICS, and also IWFM. So if you do want to get involved in the projects, please do drop us a line as well. Okay. So that's a quick overview in terms of the project and where we're moving towards. The purpose of this session was to look very much about greenhouse gas emissions, but some lessons learned from organisations that have been involved in it, and some tools, tips around what to look out for as well. So I'll hand over to Lewis first.
Good morning, everyone. And yeah, thank you to everyone who's joined in on the call today, and especially to Aclaro and IWFM for the invitation. Yeah, my name is Lewis Chenery, and my current position is Head of Environment and Sustainability for Bouygues Energies and Services. Just a heads up as well, true to form, at 12:01, it sounded like some building work started very close by. So if you hear some drilling, that's the reason why. Next slide. So just before I go any further, just 1 minute on who we are. So we're probably most known, or Bouygues generally are probably most known for being a construction or a telecoms company, but we do a lot of activity all under the kind of built environment banner. and we hope we have a global presence. So, but the majority of our work currently in Europe, about 52% of our work is in with Europe. Within the UK, we have 3 core business units. So firstly, FM, which is most appropriate for today. So that's a mixture of public and private sector clients, schools, hospitals, university, and then some corporate partners as well. Secondly, it's infra, which is, or infrastructure as we call it internally, and that's predominantly the kind of upgrading of motorway and local street lighting furniture, all with it under the kind of decarbonisation banner. And then finally, we have the energy department or function 2. So that's again feeding off from that decarbonisation banner, and we deliver everything from solar farms, heat networks, energy performance contracts, and kind of anything in between. Just a quick overview of the content for the next couple of slides. So I'm going to go into some detail and share what Scope 3 means to Bouygues, and put some perspective into it and of how it contributes to our kind of wider emissions baskets. I'm then going to share some of the challenges and lessons learned that we faced as well, and particularly around the kind of the data element. Obviously, a huge topic, Scope 3. So I'm going to decided to hone in on the kind of the purchase goods and services element too. So how we're engaging our FM suppliers in that context. And then finally share some of the kind of benefits and guidance and some of the things that we found useful. I thought it'd be useful as well to set some context in terms of where we're heading. So our carbon ambitions in the UK, so Bouygues Construction in the UK, for our direct emissions, so working towards a net zero for scopes 1 and 2 by 2025, which is a very, very aggressive target. And for scope 3, so the indirect emissions that Sunil's just introduced, we've agreed at least a 30% reduction by 2030. And the team's now working collectively to look what a net zero scope 3 target will look like. And kind of underpinning all of those targets and being complemented by the kind of usual frameworks that most of you will be familiar with. So your SBTIs, your CDP disclosures, and kind of moving towards the way of thinking under the kind of TCFD element too. Digging into the details now, and a slide on perspective. If we first focus on the left-hand graph, that's our scope 1 and 2 emissions, and that's a collection of the last 4 years. So that includes our project fuel for our delivering things like solar farms and construction projects or smaller construction projects, fuel used in our commercial vehicles and company cars, building gases and other refrigerants. And then the orange section is the electricity that we procure for our properties. We've had some super reductions in that element, especially last year was particularly good for us, but I suspect that's probably a larger conversation for a different time. Now, what I want you to do is to copy and paste that graph on the left and put it into the graph on the right. And then you can see immediately how quickly that gets lost in the ocean. For a bit of a kind of naff metaphor, you can hardly even see the orange electricity contribution. So for us, we have a collection of FM construction type projects. So that means our scope 3 is slightly larger than the normal FM company, and around 96% of our emissions fall within that kind of upstream category. So that's a far cry away from the 72%, which is on average that Sunil shared earlier. I'm going to break this down a bit further now, so we can start to get an idea about how these different elements contribute towards the overall GHG inventory for us. You can see on the graph, the pie chart on the left, the overwhelming contribution is the purchase goods and services. So that's to clarify and just kind of feeding off of what Sunil said, and that's broadly for us the embodied emissions associated with the goods that we purchase and the apportioned emissions associated with the services that we procure as well through the business. So in summary, that's the kind of supply chain contribution to our scope 3 emissions. If you look down that list as well, you can see waste is a big impact for us. So it's really important for us to tie that kind of circular economy piece in with emissions reductions. And you can see commercial vehicles in there alongside employee commuting. Each of those different contributors have their own unique and very complex challenges. But if you were, as I mentioned, to compare this list to kind of other FM companies, it would look very different. because as I mentioned, that one of our core functions as an FM provider is the projects that we deliver to. So hence a large onus on the purchased goods. And that's looking at things from everything from refurbishing hospital walls, painting a room even, all the way through to building new parts of schools, etc., etc. So a really big impact in that part of the business. So for us, a strategic priority for the scope 3 element has got to have that at the core. I love the analogy on the right, and I use this time and time again, the iceberg analogy. So the scope 1 and 2 being the visible tip of the emissions iceberg, so that you have direct control over, and a submerged part being scope 3, the less visible and then therefore less manageable. Oh, that's jumped around a bit on my slides, but I'll jump into this one. So a few things that we put in place to try and get the supply chain engaged on scope 3. One of them is about supplier engagement at the start of the process. So requiring that suppliers from as soon as we're in contact with them in terms of a professional perspective, is ensuring that our supply chain is capturing metrics. And secondly, sharing that on a regular basis. So ensuring that everyone from day one is on the kind of same page and knows what we need to deliver. I'll go into a few of them, in a few more detail, in a few more slides. But the performance review process as well is something that we've been integrating into our kind of procurement processes, I suppose. So building in performance ratings and actions around carbon as a kind of core topic, but then also phasing in things like the wider sustainability topics. So things like modern slavery, circular economy, and various other things under the kind of sustainability banner. But that process in itself has helped procurement and sustainability work closer together and be in sync. The other part is about the bespoke engagement. I think this is a really, really important one. So we've got a hugely diverse supply chain. Something we're proud of, but is a challenge, is that just under 70% of our supply chain is SME status or smaller. Therefore, it's really critical when we talk about carbon and scope 3 and all of these kind of complicated topics, that it needs to be in a tailored, relevant approach. The broad brush communications do work and they serve their purpose, but a bespoke kind of strategy facilitates more action. I'm going to stay on the theme of purchase goods and service here, and it's again, just to reiterate, it's the supply chain emissions, and share some high-level details of how we've developed a high-level engagement plan. And this is all with the process, or all of the aim to essentially reduce emissions within that sector. But firstly, improving the data to be able to do that. So we knew at the start of our process that we needed to build a foundation. We knew it was going to be hazy, but we needed something to go off from. So that meant creating a baseline. So we started off using the first step, which is using a spend and activity-based methodology. And that was to establish the key metrics that we need to go forward. So we needed to find out where our high intensity procurement categories were. And that's the kind of the ones that are kind of no surprise: your construction type materials, your electrical machinery, HVAC, those sorts of things. We then needed to identify who our high intensity suppliers were. And then finally, understand who our high intensity contracts were and projects. So creating that baseline to give us a kind of blueprint to go from. We then developed a supplier maturity matrix, and that was to really understand the gaps in knowledge around carbon within the supply chain. So we did a survey looking at things like data, financing, governance and disclosure, training, and kind of various other topics. And what that has allowed us to do is to tailor our engagement program and tailor how we talk to our suppliers and communicate on both a wider scale and on a one-to-one level as well. So the next stage of that, so moving up to the kind of measure stage, so that's refining the measurement stage, refining the measurements that we have already. And that's where we're at now. So this is the part where we're very much focused on working on a one-to-one basis to improve that data. So we're requesting things like utility data, mileage from the vehicles associated with our work, product information, requesting things like EPD, so environmental certificates for any products that they're supplying, but then also refining the requested data to use things like the supply chain sustainability carbon calculator and so forth. But as I mentioned, it's all with the aim of reducing those emissions within the scope 3 category. Going to bring it back down onto the kind of FM level now and focus on some of the kind of practical tools that we've developed. And this is to really empower a bottom-up approach for FM managers, ops managers to start firstly understanding their impacts and then addressing them. So we've taken that really important scope 3 data derived from procurement, applied the various conversion factors, understanding where and who it's been purchased from, and et cetera, et cetera. So that gives a manager or a director, influencer in terms of procurement, they can come into this dashboard, select the sites or sector that they're associated with, and immediately understand who and what needs their attention. So it generates some high-level kind of results, carbon impact, kilogram of carbon per turnover of the contract, what categories of purchases are their main contributors, and kind of so on through that process. It also generates, and this is really useful for kind of my team, a league table of suppliers who are the most carbon intensive. So you can see on the right and the bottom right of the screen right now, hopefully, an anonymized league table. And I've anonymized that so I don't end up in a lawsuit, but it's given us some useful information, such as 11% of our supply chain is roughly responsible for around 80% of our kind of emissions in a procured goods and services strategy. The other thing to mention from a kind of site and FM contract level is that we've been producing annual scope 3 reports for our contribution to our clients. So that's covering everything from commuting, business travel, office and management suite use, purchase goods and services, and everything in between. And that's, again, it's to really encourage that bottom-up kind of onboarding to tackle these emissions, but really useful and something solid and a blueprint to work from, rather than it just be a large, really complicated academic subject. On to the key challenges now, and I think these challenges are probably very common for everyone that's tried to tackle this. But the availability of data, so I think everyone knows this by now. Scope 3 emissions are really difficult to capture because they require kind of input from the whole supply chain, and that in itself is really difficult to obtain, a really laborious task. And we often lack that access to getting that next step. Our supply chains in FM are quite unique in that they are super complex as well. So that involves multiple suppliers, multiple contractors, multiple subcontractors, subcontractors, and reoccurring. So as a result, tracking and obtaining that and then influencing that is super time consuming and super challenging as well, because things change all the time as well. Sunil's touched on the standardization as well. This is a big gap, and it's why this project has been kind of come at a really good time. There is no standardized way of measuring and reporting scope 3 emissions in FM. It exists in other parts, manufacturing's a bit further ahead and so on, but it makes it really difficult for companies like ours, and probably many on the call, to be able to benchmark emissions against industry standards, best practice, etc. So yeah, the project that Sunil is managing is a really apt time to be progressing this, but it's a big project. The control element as well. So all of our scope 3 emissions are generated outside of the direct control of an FM company. So for example, emissions from transport and the transportation of goods and services, again, that last mile delivery is often not captured. So if you can't capture it, and that's really difficult, how is anyone supposed to influence it? So all of these gaps in data prove that this is a hugely challenging topic, and one that needs involvement from every element throughout the whole value chain. The awareness part as well, I know everyone's probably seen or heard of scope 3. but it's still an emerging subject. The awareness from it, both from corporates, from suppliers, even probably from government, local authorities and the like, have not got a grasp of how this all fits in with the wider net zero element or targets. So in order for us to really progress on this, the awareness probably shouldn't be at the bottom of this table on the screen. It should probably be at the top in terms of challenges, because without awareness, we can't create the desire to change, the knowledge, the desire to change, the ability to change and to improve. Next slide. So benefits and conclusions from my experiences. Scope 3, it does have the biggest influence to change culture from a procurement, from a sustainability perspective. Although it's a bit of an acronym word now, or a bit of a kind of buzzword, I do think it's one of those rare subtopics that has and will drive innovation and collaboration. It just has to, if we're going to reduce all throughout the supply chain. The environmental benefits, I think they're pretty obvious, you know, less carbon, less mileage, less deliveries, less all of it. The reputational advantage as well, and this feeds into the financial benefit as well, because this is still very much a emerging area. It is still possible for companies, whether you're a supplier, whether you're an FM contractor, to put your head above and to show some thought leadership in this process. I think that, again, like I say, it really feeds into that into that leadership area. Attracting and retaining talent as well. We're all probably suffering from attracting and retaining good people in the business, and if we can demonstrate, and this is the same for our clients, if we can demonstrate that we are diligent, not just in our own operations, but all throughout the supply chain, and aligning it with other things such as social value, modern slavery, due diligence, that will attract better people and keep people in your business for longer. The compliance element to it as well is super important. There's a whole host of acronyms, PP&06, SECR, SFDR, ISSB, that will all eventually come down the value chain where you have to disclose this as well. So if you can get ahead on this at this point and understand your contribution within Scope 3, it will ensure that you're compliant as well. The slides have kind of jumped around a bit, so I'm going to loop back into some final tips and guidance. But for us, I really do shout about this topic, but governance, and this is absolutely one of my favorite topics, but I think one of the most impactful in terms of embedding sustainability is super important. So one of the most important things that we've done is to integrate our procurement and sustainability department. So procurement and sustainability and fleet, which is another one of our big impacts, all sits under the same director that feeds straight into our XCON board. That in itself just facilitates and empowers people to collaborate further, even if it's just within the office because you sit close to each other. But the level of collaboration between our procurement department and the suppliers has absolutely risen exponentially, and there's been so many good outcomes from that. Putting in a leadership steering group as well has helped review our supplier focused KPIs around Scope 3 as well. So having a bit of accountability, reviewing these on a monthly basis and seeing where the gaps are. And then finally, under the governance element, and it's around the collaboration again, is embedding yourselves and your teams within clients' sustainability networks. If you get NHS needs to decarbonize, healthcare, education sector does need to the same, and so do all of your kind of corporate commercial clients as well. So if you can embed and speak the same language together from an FM perspective, you will see improvements and really good things to come out of it. Another tip as well, and I mentioned it already, but it's aligning to or making sure that you prioritize high intensity suppliers. We've all got limited resources. We know even as big businesses are like ours, we don't have all the time and all the day to be able to just focus on this. So if you focus on your kind of high intensity, high spend, high carbon supply chain, then that's probably the best use of your time. There's no point spending days and days with someone who does, delivers stationery once a year for you. Aligning to external frameworks as well, and there's many of them, and we could probably sit here and talk about those all day. But when you do come to start your measurement, make sure that they're aligned with something reputable. So the SBTIs is a good way to start. GHG protocol is a bit the kind of Bible, I suppose, to look towards, and things like the ISO, so your sustainable procurement standard, is useful as well. If you are a manufacturer, I would say consider an EPD as well for your products. So that's essentially an environmental certificate that looks at your global warming impact, your carbon impact, the waste produced and developed as part of the manufacturing process, as well as kind of transportation. More than anything, that will give you competitive advantage in the future, because it's only it's only a matter of time before businesses like ours start contractualizing the disclosure of these when we go through the procurement phase. And lastly, is to make your strategy inclusive, and I've touched on that slightly as well. But if you are engaging your supply chain on scope 3 emissions measurement reduction, tie it in with other things. If you're sitting down once every couple of months, you may as well talk about modern slavery, your due diligence, your circular economy, designing out waste, whatever you want to call it. But it's a really good opportunity and a good opening conversation into the supply chain. And one that's not just about money as well, it can be some good things. So again, social value is a really good add-on to kind of lift the conversation with that. So that's me there, I think. Hopefully that's been a bit of use. So I'll take a pause there.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Lewis. Really in depth looking at the challenges that you have, 96% of scope 3 emissions, and as you say, a supply chain where the majority of your suppliers are SME status, and then talking through about that structured approach of the engagement of suppliers and how you're getting them on board. And a lot of that is around improving the quality of data, but also an element of upskilling in there. So the key challenges that you've mentioned are the same that we see across the board. So around the data, but also having that standardized approach. So you've got consistency, but confidence in the numbers as well. And I think then what's worked for you really well is bringing together that procurement and sustainability teams together. So tackling that really difficult parts of embedding that into the supply chain processes happens together in that one go. Fantastic. Thank you very much. So our next speaker is Augustin from Optima, who's going to be talking around the approach which they've taken to also looking at greenhouse gases, but also the application of that into the services provision and the activities which they're providing. Augustin?
Indeed. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you to the IWFM for the space. It's a pleasure for me to be part of this webinar. I'm Agustin Covelo. I'm the Transformation Project Manager of Optima, a Spanish company with more than 9,000 employees all over the Spanish territory. The objective of this presentation is to share some of the tools, principles, and guidelines that we follow in the path of preparing the inventory. Greenhouse gases plays an important role in global climate change. Monitoring and the GHG inventory are necessary to assess the potential impact of climate change and to develop adaptations and mitigation strategies. It's important to highlight that there's a marked difference in terms of measuring the carbon footprint of an organization and carrying out its inventory. Since carrying out the calculation only yields the value of the equivalent CO2 tons of generated, carrying out an inventory implies the quantification, monitoring, reporting, and verification of GHG emissions and other removals. As we all well know, what we do not measure, we do not control. And what we do not control, we will not be able to improve it. The objective of the inventory is to count the gases emitted and absorbed by the atmosphere during a determined period of time, generally a calendar year for a company. Now, are all the emissions computed? The answer is no. Only the anthropogenics, which are those that exclusively cover the GHG generated as a result of human activities. Here's the first great challenge of generating a robust inventory: knowing the totality of the impact of human activities that the company encompasses. And the challenge does not end up here. If it were an homogeneous and constant action over time, it will be easy to know and to predict the variable of human action. But we all well know that this is not the case. Each individual reacts different to the stimuli in their environment. Each person is unique with their own interests, motivations, abilities, and limitations. These individual characteristics largely determine the type of response that a person will have in a given situation. That is, in an ideal condition, we will know all the internal and external stimuli that will condition a variable. With this information, we will predict or estimate with great precision how a person responds or will respond each day to a certain situation. If, for example, he's going to take the train to work, or if for some particular reason he would be driving, or perhaps neither of them, and he decided not going to work. By knowing the value of that variable, we will know exactly the impact of human activity. But we can neither know nor predict those stimuli that condition this small cycle. So the focus will be directly in the scope of the variable. In this variability is where the importance of using solid tools with scientific justification lies. They offer us a guarantee of precision, reliability, speed, and consistency that will help us later to make better decisions, save time, resources, and generate more focused GHG reduction plans. For the elaboration of this inventory and taking into account what has been said previously, from Optima, we'll follow the following principles, of which in this occasion, we will be emphasizing in two of them. These are the principles that I consider best represent the purpose of this webinar that summon us all. Let's start with the first one. When we talk about accuracy, we refer to make sure that the quantification of GHG emissions and removal does not observe errors. And how do we ensure this? Under the generation of a system that will guide our actions at all times. A system whose objective is to arrive at the same result or a currently similar result under different calculation methods. This property or ability to reach the same final state, starting from different initial conditions and restoring to different paths, is called equifinality. Therefore, the basis of success are starting from different initial conditions, trying to find the greatest possible diversity of options. If, for example, we want to calculate the energy used by our machinery, we can start by reading the consumption standards of each type of machinery. For example, an average vacuum cleaner consumes X kilowatts. Or we could read the technical sheet of each of the assets that are in use. Or we could evaluate, if it's possible, the variability in energy consumption of a date that is that the machinery is not used against a date that is in use, and so on. Then we must address each of those chosen paths, starting from different initial conditions from multiple perspectives, that is, multiple paths. The objective is to reach the same final state. In a general sense, equifinality reflects that the end of the searching process is linked to the organizational nature of the system and not to the beginning of this process. In this way, we can have a sample of data whose uncertainty is adequate to allow decision-making. When we talk about uncertainty, we refer to mathematical uncertainty. That is the one that is inherent in any measurement process, due to the impossibility of knowing exactly the value of the measurement. This is where the statistics tool that will measure the dispersion of data comes in, like the standard deviation, the variance, the range, among others. These tools are essential to predict trends and patterns of behavior that establish solid foundations on the data we are providing. To minimize this uncertainty, we must make sure to take dispersion measurements to their lowest possible expression, stressing each data obtained. Then we can get a weighted average of all the data. And why a weighted average and not a simple one? Because here's when our criteria will enter to define which path that we have taken to reach each piece of information has more weighted in the final calculation. Let's analyze a particular case about one of the most controversial categories within the scope 3, that is the displacement of employees. A Spanish report from Spain of the Metropolitan Mobility Observatory shows that 30% of Spanish people use the public transport. On the other hand, following the principle of equifinality, we also analyzed a survey carried out by Optima among a small group of 100 workers, which had resulted in 65 of them using the metro or the bus to go to their jobs. So here we have a problem. I can't use any data because I don't have the necessary tools to justify a correct value, with which we proceed to analyze the value in greater depth to reduce our data dispersions. Nearly 80% of the company's clients are located within the region of Catalonia. So it will be wise to focus on the statistics of the province of Barcelona. Inside of Barcelona, 41% of the people with active mobility use the public transport. Of course, this data will depend on the distance of our employees are from their jobs. This is a piece of information that the company has. The distance follows a normal distribution, we can see it over here, with a mean of 10 kilometers, and where the probability that the employee has to travel more than 1.5 kilometers to go to work, this is the maximum distance an employee is willing to work, is about 90%. This is why we can absorb almost 90% of the percentage of people who walk to work. We will be also be able to obtain the result of a population sample obtained from an additional survey carried out by the company with 100 different workers. This is the other survey, in which it was found that 59% of the employees use the public transport. What will remain now is to perform a weighted average of the data obtained and arrive at a percentage that we can use. We can do the same later with the type of transport that takes that percentage of population, another field that we don't have an accurate data. Now, I had previously mentioned that I was going to address 2 of the 5 principles that we follow to carry out the inventory. The next issue to be addressed then is the completeness. We cover sources of GHG emissions and removals in a way that is mutually exclusively and collectively exhaustive. And why? Because it is the way to generate a robust inventory that we can use later, and that serves as a basis of developing methodologies, assess what we have done, and for evaluate projections, with which we must consider all the sources emissions, as we already said, anthropogenic ones, for which we are responsible. This is the part of collectively exhaustive part. In such a way that the same emission source is never found in 2 different categories. This is the mutually exclusive part. That is, for example, we will not be able to consider a trip by an employee as a trip to the workplace and also as a business trip. An ideal example is the energy sector, which, with the identification of the percentage of emissions from the inventory that corresponds to the activity of electricity generation, it is possible, as we do for this purpose, to promote the diversification of the energy matrix by promoting the use of renewable energies. But in our case, as FM providers, we use energy in various instances of the value chain. We use it both in our administrative office, in all our delegations, as well as in the client's home. An inventory will then consider all energy consumptions for which we are responsible, or it's our responsibility to take significant action to reduce it. In this way, if our objective is to significantly reduce the electricity consumption of our actions, this inventory will help us to visualize where we are having a greater impact, and thus we can prioritize our actions. In other words, if our greatest impact is in our administrative office, the priority will be to generate actions in that sector, either by reducing the consumptions and or contracting energy providers with a higher percentage of renewable energy. On the other hand, if our greatest impact is in the provision of services, our actions can be like make work groups more efficient, invest in assets with greater energy efficiency, or generate an asset management plan that indicates the state of the life cycle of our assets to identify possible excess consumption due to the general wear and tear, among others. In conclusion, I think that everyone here is familiar with the need of the human being to measure. From the beginning of time, these facts allowed objectivity to be introduced in the act of comparing. That is, if the observation can be quantified in some way, expressed in terms of value, it's possible for communication to avoid interference from the particularities of each individual. In this way, by having a value of GHG inventory expressed in numbers, we are able to begin to objectively measure what our impact is, serving as an instrument that raises public awareness regarding the environmental pollution, inform them about emissions of individual sources, and allowed us to compare emissions from different sources at a different location if it's applicable. This last concept gives rise to another of the principles that guide our action in carrying out the inventory, that, although it did not fall within the original scope of this webinar, it's worth briefly introducing it, which is the principle of comparability. Our GHG inventory should allow companies to compare the environmental performance with other companies with similar activities, thus facilitating the environmental management of these activities and generating joint or synchronous actions to generate a greatest impact, and that we make the whole greater than the sum of its parts. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Augustine. So I think you came at it from a slightly different direction. So a lot of this was talking around behaviours from individuals. And I think linked up with what Lewis was talking about, it's the behaviours that help to use the data to be able to make different decisions. And so it's not just the data on its own, but it's also the decision making that takes place, which helps to lead towards the changes that are going to be necessary. So along with that data, the consistency, the calculations, what you're talking through is around the ability that has to drive change through as a result of having targets, science-based targets, but also having forward trajectories. And I think that's very much an area that we're also advocating, is the development of targets should come after you have a full understanding of the inventory, because that allows you to be able to talk about how you're going to meet up with your target. And then the other part of that is, if you are looking at that consistency and the calculations, it also allows you to have the ability to be able to compare. And again, an element mentioned from Lewis, and something which we're doing with the Scope 3 research project, is to have that comparability. That allows in itself then for more conversations to take place, whether it's from a supplier and an organisation itself, or within the company as well. Okay. So we've got a number of questions which have come through, and if you've got any questions now, please do pop them into the Q&A function as well. We've got around about 10 minutes or so for some questions. So if I start off, Augustine, for yourself, what's been the main benefits to your business of looking at greenhouse gas emissions and starting to capture and calculate those emissions?
Okay, if we talk about benefits, we could consider both internal and external benefits. On the one hand, any activity that we carry out within the company will directly or indirectly generate GHG emissions. Whether it's a purchase or sale of a product, a transfer, a waste, or simply turning the light on and off. In order to correctly measure the volume of emissions of each category, we will inevitably need to have a large amount of data and a system for obtaining it. in some way, generating a robust inventory help us to audit our company internally, to know what we are measuring and what we are not. And based on that, to know which categories are under our control and which one we should focus on. On the other hand, as we mentioned, we can improve everything that we measure and we control. The great benefit of generating an inventory is to establish the basis of actions on which all subsequent improvement activities will be based. This will lead us to generate not only economic benefits for our company, but also generate actions that are more aligned with environmental, social, and good corporate governance visions.
Thank you, Augustine. We've got a question from Reed, which has come in around the supply chain. So Lewis, if I can put that towards you. When dealing with suppliers, including SMEs, are you monitoring their performance improvement and even changing your selection criteria for suppliers?
Very good question. I wouldn't say we're monitoring all of the supply chain. We're definitely measuring, but again, it's using that kind of broader brush, spend-based methodology to get a figure. I mentioned in my my presentation that 11% of our suppliers have got a big chunk that are, you know, the significant impacts to our business. We're definitely measuring and monitoring those because that's where we need to. So that's a very, you know, transactional way of monitoring their performance, because again, that's a real contributor to us. So we need to be on top of that. I wouldn't say we're penalising performance at the moment. We're not in that stage, and I don't want to be in that stage just yet. It's still a very much you know, synergistic. Here's your emissions. How can we help? We've discovered this, etc., etc., etc. Here's something innovative to kind of, you know, attack those emissions. So definitely monitoring big ones, monitoring at a lower level from a less kind of accurate database or kind of methodology. But in terms of selection criteria, yes, we are starting to do that. We've developed, and again, I kind of did a high-level reference to it about the ITT kind of process that we put in place. That's not just around emissions, that's around everything that the other kind of topics as well. I wouldn't say that we've selected a supplier for a big project because of carbon performance yet, but that is the trajectory of it. And that's the same, I think, coming down as well. So when government appoint contracts, that will be an influencing factor who wins that work. So that's only a matter of time before it goes government, us, and then down and down and down. So if that answers your question.
Yeah, and I think linked up with that as well is, what are you looking for from your suppliers to help you and to help your customers?
Good question as well. So 3 things, I think. Data is one of them. Better data, please. And then moving away from that, again, spend a broad brush approach to actual data so we can help. Solutions as well. So if you are supplying something on a regular basis, whether, you know, it's HVAC equipment, whether it's stationary, whether it's something large and above, what have you got? What other options have you got? What lower carbon? What lower environmental impacts? What social opportunities can you present with that as well? And I think that dovetails and is one and the same about innovation as well. You know, it's a new solution. How can we innovate as well? But what I really like, and I think where our department in terms of sustainability and external suppliers, where it kind of really comes to life, is about the proactiveness of it. So, you know, rather than just wait for us to say these sorts of things, come forward, come to, you know, webinars, share what experiences that you've got, because if we're both proactive in trying to reduce as well as solutions come up, then yeah, the outcome's always kind of favorable. So I'll say those things. So yeah, data, kind of solutions, and innovation and proactivity.
Fantastic, thank you. We've got a question from Herv. How do you control the risk of double reporting while capturing and reporting the carbon emissions data? Augustine?
Yes, this is an interesting question. Of course, it's definitely a risk that we cannot ignore. But the more control you have the action system, that is define a rigorous work plan, do the correct follow-up, and above all, understand your total impact. This is the total value change that make up the company, the lower the risk. So you have to understand the total value that we are creating, and every one of the steps that we are in. And if you do that, the lower the risk is.
Yeah, I come in there as well on scope 3 and double counting. Probably from a way different part from Augustine is that I wouldn't spend too much time worrying about it as well. If it's not, there's going to be double counting all throughout scope 3. It is, but the mentality that I have with it is that that's going to exist. If it's not something legally that you have to disclose, etc. Scope 3 is about influencing change. So we can measure it and monitor it and know that there may be some double counting, then I think that's a good mindset as well, because if you get too down into the details about, back and forth about who's this belong to, etc., then it can prevent progress as well, I think.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And scope 3 is intended to be somebody else's scope 1 and 2.
Yep.
Which is why it's categorized separately. But as you both say, it's about the engagement and it's about driving change. And we've got a number of levers that we have available to do that. But we've also got a number of levers that we're asking for our suppliers and employees and customers to also support them as well. Yeah. A question for myself here to both of you is, whilst there's a lot of talk around this, there's a number of organisations which have maybe been doing their direct emissions, their scope 1 and 2 for a while, and they're just embarking on scope 3 and starting the process of capturing that. What advice, given that you've been around and been providing the reporting on this, what advice would you give to companies who are just starting on the process today? Augustine, if I come to you first.
Yes, of course. That's a good question. Generating a GHG inventory is not a simple thing. It's not something that can be done overnight. Doing things correctly takes the same time as doing them incorrectly. What I always recommend is to have a structure and an action plan. Define the scope of each of the categories, assign the person responsible of the data, and stress each data to verify the veracity. It's always good to have a vision of automatization where we can obtain the data more and more easily. After all, the final objective is to carry out periodic control to visualize the impact of the improvement activities carried out.
Fantastic. I think I'm going to remember your quote, doing it correctly takes the same amount of time as doing it incorrectly. I think we might be using that.
Yeah, that's a very important phrase. It's one of my favorites.
Lewis?
Yeah, good question. I think if you do have limited resources, and I kind of bang this drum quite a lot, is look up into the supply chain. If you're feeding into a bigger company, we as Bouygues very much encourage you to get in contact with us to help you. We'll sit down with you, spend a couple of hours going through it all, give you some kind of key tools. There's a lot of free carbon calculators online as well, and they appear every other day now. So Google is a cop-out answer, but have a look at that and make sure it's aligned with something reputable, such as the GHG protocol. If you're a bit more serious and you've got maybe some kind of more commitments, then I'd say DEFRA conversion factors is kind of my Bible. It won't capture everything, but DEFRA, the government, release an Excel workbook every year. You can download that, read the guidance. There's some YouTube information as well along with it, and then that's got the conversion factors, which is way more simple than people think. I think so. If you've got a meters cube of water, you times it by a conversion factor. There's your emissions. It's a simple way to do it. So, like I say, lean on the supply chain. Use Google online calculators as your friends. Make sure you do due diligence with it, and then for the UK folk, have a look at the DEFRA conversion factors as well.
Yeah, and also have a look at the Essa for my guidance, Scope 3 guidance.
I forgot.
That provides the framework around the reporting. Yeah, fantastic. Fantastic. So we're just coming up to the time now. So we've had a few more questions that have come in. What we'll try and do is to get to those, and we'll answer those outside of this session. Just to close out, so there's a couple of other webinars and events that are taking place. So there's 2 more IWFM webinars which are going to take place. There's one on Introduction to Net Zero, which is coming up, I believe, in June, and also a 3rd session on developing a roadmap and developing a target. And so it's how do you use the data and then provide that forward plan with that knowledge and that information. I mentioned earlier on about if you want to get involved in the Scope 3 FM project, we've got the guidance information and some tools that are available, but we've also got the Scope 3, the Stage 3 piece of the work, which is going to be taking place later on this year. Any questions, and if you do want to get involved in that, please do contact us directly or hop onto the website for some further information. Just left for me to say thank you very much, Augustine and Lewis, for your contribution there. Really, really valuable information there. I think just as a quick summary, we're talking very much about the data part of it and about providing and capturing quality data, but it takes time to capture that data. There's a quote which I've attributed to Unilever, but it may not be from them. They've been running their Scope 3 operations for 15 years, and they've said they're just scratching the surface of it. So it is about building up, cumulatively developing that and working with supply chain and others to develop that up. The other part of it, though, is around the behaviours, and it's about what you do with the data, the information, and how does that influence the organisation and the conversations that you have as well. So the data is one part of it, but it's about how you choose to use it that will really start to change performance as well. So I think those would be my 2 key takeaways from this session, and hopefully look forward to seeing you at the other IWFM events. Thank you very much.
Thanks all. Have a good day.
You.